I thought it might be fun to discuss with you guys 25 books that everyone should read, 25 classic books that everyone should read just for their influence, not necessarily because they're good or because, you'll even enjoy them. But there are just some books that I feel like they've influenced the literary canon so much, and when you read other books or even watch movies or television shows, there's often references to them that you don't even realize unless you've read that book.
Let me know in the comments down below, how many of these have you read? How many of these do you plan on reading? And how many of these, no matter what, you will never read this book because you know what? You don't care how influential it is. You're never going to read it. And that's okay too.
So this is in no particular order. I just started thinking about this and then I randomly thought Anne of Green Gables, that's one of them. I feel like this is a book that is very influential. I actually love this book, this series of book. I've read the whole series many times. I don't know, I just feel like there's so many people out there who are looking for their Gilbert Blythe, right? And I don't necessarily know if that's a good thing because he's a figment of Ellen Montgomery's imagination and he doesn't exist in real life. Next up, Pride and Prejudice. This is another one, very influential. So many remakes of it, so many references to it in everything from romantic comedies to, dark thrillers. 1984. This is a very, very influential book. Even just walking around day to day, you're going to even talk to people and there might be a reference to this book or something that was in this book. We all know about the Ministry of Truth, right? The big brother that's censoring what it is that you should know. The Catcher in the Rye. This is another one. I personally don't like this book, but I feel like it's something that everyone should read. Don Quixote. I have not read this book, but it is super influential. I actually just read The Three Musketeers and Alexandre Dumas. He actually talked about Don Quixote in the book, so it's referenced all the time. I will also say that a lot of times people say that this is the first novel, but in reality, I actually think that The Tale of Genji, that is actually the first modern novel. It is much older than Don Quixote, so I'll have to put The Tale of Genji on there. I sort of am using this as 5 and 5A. Great Expectations, Charles Dickens, that's another one. Charles Dickens himself, in terms of his plotting. Sometimes his pacing can be a little bit slow, but I do think that the structures of his books are very influential. Catch-22, so this is a very famous World War II novel about a man who is in a catch-22, hence the phrase catch-22. That's how that phrase was coined. The Color Purple, another very influential, very beautiful book. There was recently another remake of it, the one that Steven Spielberg did. That was just an absolutely beautiful movie. This is a book that I loved, but also at the same time, I feel like it's a book everyone should read, purely for its influence. The Great Gatsby. Now, this is a book I have not read, and if I'm taking my own advice, I should read it, even though I personally have never actually met someone who liked this book. It is pretty short, so I feel like I'll have to read it one day. Jane Eyre. This is another one that's been remade so many times. There's been so many books that have been influenced by it. I mean, it's just one of those things that, you kind of just have to read it. Wuthering Heights, another one, super influential. I actually just read it last year. It was one of the first books that talked about, taboos like abuse, racism, things like that weren't really talked about at the time. 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So this is super influential just because of its magical realism. I have never read this book, but I feel like it's one of those that I'm eventually going to get to. I've heard that it's pretty slow and also pretty hard to follow because a lot of the people have the same names. It's a multi-generational story about a big family and, some of the fathers name the sons the same name, so it's hard to keep the characters, in your mind. I might actually listen to it. I think there is a version of this on audio that's read by John Lee. He's one of my favorite narrators, so maybe I'll try that one. Beloved by Toni Morrison. So this is one that, again, it was really pushing the boundaries in terms of how do you talk about things that are really traumatic? How do you deal with these things in literature and, basically just talk about them. Moby-Dick. Now this is one, man, it is just referenced in so many different arenas of entertainment, whether that's The Simpsons.
Goodbye, Springfield. From hell's heart, I stab at thee.
To other books, to everything. I've never read it, but again, it's one of those books that I feel like eventually I will have to read. A good friend of mine actually just finished listening to it, and she said that, yeah, it is pretty slow, but she felt like it was definitely worth listening to. The Count of Monte Cristo, perhaps the father of the modern soap opera. Definitely scandalous, definitely a page turner, definitely you can feel its influence to this day. To Kill a Mockingbird, I know I just keep saying this over and over again, but you can see how it has influenced modern day culture, modern day literature, modern day movies, modern day everything. Now, Little Women, that's another one. I remember reading Little Women as a young woman and just how the story affected me.
I have loved you ever since I've known you, Joe. I couldn't help it.
And it was interesting because my daughter recently just read it, and then seeing her reaction to it, how it was different from my reaction, it was a pretty fun experience, and it is definitely a story. Its reverberations are felt throughout modern culture today. I'm gonna have to put Frankenstein and Dracula on there. I have read Dracula, but I haven't read Frankenstein. Dracula was a little bit slow. I felt like it was a victim of its own success in that because of its influence, because there is just so much of modern culture that is influenced by it. You know, I knew even before I read the book that, you know, you stay away from Dracula with garlic, that you have to kill him with a stake in his heart. I mean, I already knew this because I've seen, you know, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So I felt like it was worth it because I wanted to read it to see sort of where the lore of Dracula was really popularized. So it was worth the read, a little slow. I've actually heard Frankenstein is better, and I might actually read that one around Halloween just, you know, because that's kind of when I read Dracula. The Lord of the Rings. I mean, how many engineer nerd memes are related to the Lord of the Rings? You can't really go on any social media site without seeing a Lord of the Rings meme. And unless you read the book, you're not going to get it. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, another highly influential book. Actually, it was recently redone in James, which has gotten a lot of hype. I haven't read James, but it might be an interesting exercise to read Huckleberry Finn and then read James. In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, highly influential. It was the father of what people call narrative nonfiction, or a novel that reads like fiction even though it's nonfiction. Not only is it highly influential, but it is also highly controversial because there are a lot of people who say that Truman Capote made up certain parts of it. So that's just really interesting sort of little asterisk to the book and something that you might want to look into after you're done reading it. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. So this is one that I've never read. I'm kind of looking at it like I would look at Les Mis. It might be a little bit hard to get through, but very much worth it. It is about Russia during the time when Napoleon is invading Russia. I feel like it's one of those books that, you know, you gotta just read it one day. You gotta just dive in and do it. The Inferno by Dante. I have read this, and because I've read it, I see references to it literally everywhere, whether you are reading a self-help book or whether you are just, you know, watching some random TV show. Now, I've got to put Shakespeare on here. I don't feel like there's any one Shakespeare play that is the most influential, but, you know, I'm just reading off a list right here. Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Macbeth, Midsummer Night's Dream, Much Ado About Nothing, King Lear. These are all referenced all the time.
No, Hamlet didn't say that.
I feel a little sad that I actually have a bachelor's degree in English, but somehow I never took a class that really delved into Shakespeare. Every single semester I would start out and I'd be like, I hope I can find a Shakespeare class, and it was never offered. I read so many other plays, and I just wish that I could have read these books with somebody who knew what they meant, or at least knew more than I did, because I feel like when I read them now, sure, I can read like the little, you know, footnotes and stuff like that, but I just feel like that I'm missing so much. So I don't know, if you know of any way to read Shakespeare in a way where you can understand it better, please let me know in the comments below. Another Russian classic, Crime and Punishment. I feel like it's kind of like War and Peace, you know, you gotta just read it.
Oh, and how could I forget Les Mis? I mean, Les Mis is everywhere in modern day culture. Everything from Anne Hathaway to all of the Les Mis references in Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton. It's everywhere. And two books that I actually just noticed while I was putting away the books that I had out for this video, Gone with the Wind and Middlemarch. These are also two classics that I feel like everyone should read because you can see their influence in so much of modern culture. You can see the influence of Middlemarch in Anne of Green Gables, which was the first book that I mentioned in this video, as well as Gone with the Wind. I mean, when I was reading that book, I kept thinking about Walter White. I mean, Scarlett O'Hara is such an anti-hero, and you can see her influence in just so many modern characters today.
And then lastly, I'm going to end, I know I'm over 25 books, I'm at 27, but I have to mention, I couldn't figure out like one science fiction book, but science fiction is so influential, especially these days where we are getting into the realm of science fiction. We are getting into, you know, AI. You know, there's so many books, Isaac Asimov, where, you know, some of the things that he talked about are happening right now. So I'm just going to read, you know, some very influential science fiction writers. It might be worth reading one of each of these authors, you know, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, Ursula K. Le Guin, Robert Heinlein, Arthur Clarke, Octavia Butler. So again, these are writers who you can see their influence in culture to this day. Well, there you go. There's a list of classics that we should all read. Let me know in the comments below if I missed anything. I'm sure I did. I mean, there's so many classics out there that I feel like they're worth the read, they're worth finishing, even if maybe, I don't know, you might have to struggle a little to do it. And as always, happy reading.